Welcome to the third and final day of the Computational Antitrust Conference. If you were not with us yesterday, what we discussed was concrete projects using computational tools to improve antitrust law. We dived into natural language processing, data visualization, and other techniques of machine learning. To make an analogy with the world of cinema, we ventured into movies like Inception. Today on the program, we are moving into an action movie. I haven't watched the latest James Bond movie yet. I prefer OSS 117. If you haven't watched it, you should. But I'm convinced that Daniel Craig will like our script very much. First of all, we will explore how computational tools can help better predict and detect killer acquisitions with the gentleman that you see on the screen right now. Second, we will explore how to automate merger procedures to address under and over enforcement in the space. Third, we will be joined by a computer scientist to discuss the unknown insights of the Microsoft case US version and how using computational tools could have made a big difference in that case. And fourth, three top officials from Brazil, the UK, and France, antitrust agencies, will join us to present their work in the space. As on Monday and yesterday, we'll remind you to please ask your questions using the Q&A function. We will do our best to address all the questions. And also, if you have something nice to say, but only if that is nice, you can use the hashtag computational antitrust on Twitter. I will put that in the chat in just a minute. Last, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter. The link will appear also in the chat in about 20 seconds. And I will put later on today a link to a Google form so we can get your feedback on the conference. Now, it is my pleasure to give the word to Jan, who is our academic outreach chair and who will be moderating the first discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Thibaut, and thanks so much for the introduction. Very, very grateful to Thibaut and Stanford for the opportunity to moderate this panel. I'm a student in Stanford currently, and prior to coming here, worked a bit in private practice on merger control. So I'm very, very excited to discuss the future merger control in this panel. And we have a great lineup. We're joined today by Professor Alex Sandy Pentland, who is a Toshiba professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he directs the MIT Connection Science Initiative. We also have Sandro Lero, who is an assistant professor at the RISC-X Institute at the Southern University of Science and Technology in Shenzhen in China, and a visiting researcher at MIT. We have Robert Mahari, who is a PhD student in the Human Dynamics group and a JD candidate at Harvard Law School. And we also have Professor Bill Kovacic, who is a global competition professor of law and policy at the George Washington University Law School, director of its Competition Law Center, and also a visiting professor at King's College, London. So without further ado, Alex, Sandra, and Robert, I'll give you the floor.
So I'm at MIT, so was Sandro, Robert is there now. And why is MIT doing computational law? And of course, at one level, it's obvious, code is law, but law is also code. And in fact, law is a special type of expert system for the most part. And so it has network properties, it has all of the sort of properties that you see in the scientific literature where you have citations and things. And this is the stuff that Robert is working on. But perhaps more importantly in this case, this sort of general framework for law is one where new rules happen very slowly. They often have implicit context rather than explicit context. And we naturally think about things like markets more than we think about things like networks. And yet today, most of the fastest growing and most influential new companies are networks. And those behave very, very differently than traditional markets. So how? Well, one is that they use preferential attachment. In other words, the ones that are most visible get the most new customers without doing anything. It's just sort of the top of mind. This is a basic mathematical function that derives from the fact that we have limited memories, limited attention. So we can only name a few companies or resources at any one point, which drives preferential attachment. And what that means is the rich get richer, but not in the normal way. This is in a way that is exponential and explosive. And that dominance is what we're seeing today. And it behaves very differently than market dominance. In market dominance, all the players are somewhat even in terms of the sort of mathematical equilibria, the Nash equilibria, things like that. But the paper that we put out in the National Academy of Sciences proves that actually in network things, you get a different dynamics, and that is that the dominance is more a function of the competition of the small guys, the general health of the participants, than it is of a small number of largest participants. And in fact, if you do something that is conventional antitrust policy, where you cut the head off of one of these big companies and you break it up, it's actually worse potentially than doing nothing, because each of them, being so large already, is so far up the network dynamics, will grow to be another monster. So you're really hurting competition, and particularly the small guys, by doing traditional sorts of things with antitrust things with network organizations. And so what can you do about this? Well, there's some simple things that you can do. One is that you want to discourage the explosive growth. You want to make them basically pay their fair share, is one way to think about it. But more importantly, you want to have nascent companies grow. That's how you actually reach an equilibrium which has the greatest innovation. So let me give you a simple example that I like, but it's far from the only way. Imagine that above a certain number of network customers, so your network reaches more than a certain number, you began to pay a infrastructure tax. And that infrastructure tax goes up not as the number of customers, but as the square of the number of customers, because the value of a network is generally proportional to the square of the number of customers, because they can connect with each other as well as with the sender, and not to the just the number of customers. So what that does is that slows the growth of these monster network entities called dragons in physics. But you could use that same sort of tax to be able to promote local people. For instance, to be able to make the smaller customers, smaller companies, much more fit. And I like the idea of having this tax on the big guys that you turn around and you use to give tax breaks to small local companies. And that way you're promoting the growth of small local companies, which has lots of other advantages, but also making the whole ecosystem a little more fit. And that's actually what you're after. So the classic notion of antitrust, where you get rid of the disproportionate ones by breaking them up, is the wrong thing to do in a network economy. Instead, what you have to do is you have to raise the average fitness. And that's what you're going to hear about from Robert and from Sandro. So Robert, you want to take it away?
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Sandy, and thank you all for letting us be here today. If we take a legal perspective and maybe a bit of a historical perspective, time and time again, US antitrust law has responded to the changing needs of the economy. So in the 1800s, we had trusts, and the Sherman Act was passed to address those. That was followed by a historic wave of mergers, and the Clayton Act was passed to address those. And so we kind of asked ourselves, well, in a network economy, in a digital economy, what are these new antitrust needs? How do we respond to new ways of competing? And we really came up with two concrete proposals. The first relates to monopoly power under the Sherman Act. So right now, what judges look at is price control and market share. And those are used to assess whether or not a company has reached kind of a state of monopoly power. But what we realized is that those are primarily symptoms of anti-competitive behavior, and you can exert anti-competitive influence long before you have a majority market share and long before you charge monopoly prices, if you ever do. And the way you can do that is by controlling data. And so what we advocate for is a expanded definition of monopoly power that takes into account data control. And in the paper, and we're happy to go into this during the Q&A, we go into different types of data ownership models. And we note that some ways of owning data raise more concern than others. And in particular, we advocate for this idea of data trusts as a way of owning data that can be done in a way that doesn't raise quite as much of an antitrust concern. The second recommendation we make is related to merger review under the Clayton Act. And so, as Sandy was explaining, there's a lot of empirical data and a lot of network science that makes us challenge this intuitive idea that we should be going after the very biggest M&A transactions and stopping the concentration of market share at that level. What we really need to worry about is today's dominant players buying up tomorrow's competition. And this can happen completely under the radar in this term called killer acquisitions, because the transactions are small, too small for regulators to take notice. And so we focus a lot on the idea of fitness, and Sandra will explain what that means in quantitative terms in just a moment. But at a high level, what we want to do is break out of anti-competitive feedback loops by thinking about the market as a whole and not just the very largest transactions. And so if I leave you with one thing for today, it's that until now, antitrust regulation has been very backward looking. It's been a reactionary discipline. And in the increasingly fast-paced digital economy, what we're hoping to do is to move towards a real-time approach to antitrust. So with that, let me hand it over to Sandro.
Thank you, Robert, and hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to explain to you how we measure these monopolistic tendencies in the data. So in the context of firm sizes, Gibrat's law states that the growth of a firm is proportional to its size. And the proportionality constant, which is essentially just the normalized percentage growth rate, is what we call the fitness. More qualitatively speaking, fitness is just a measure of how fast a firm is able to grow, how innovative it is, or how well it can compete. And a key insight that we derive from network science is that the growth rate distributions, rather than the size distributions, are relevant to predict monopolies. To sustain an economy where there is no firm that completely dominates, it is important to have a lot of high fitness firms which are able to compete. Now, it becomes problematic when there is only a handful or even just one company that exhibits high growth. But if you have a lot of firms, all of which exhibit high growth, competition will predictably emerge. So it's really about growth rather than size. And to show this, we have analyzed the acquisitions of startups with data from Crunchbase. Robert, if you can just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So here what you can see along the x-axis, we show firm fitness, which we have proxied by the growth rate of follow-up investments. But there's many different proxies for growth, for fitness, and we have tried several, all of which lead to qualitatively similar conclusions. And along the y-axis, we just show the relative frequency. So now if you first look at the gray lines in the back, these show the base rate distribution across all firms. But then the dashed lines on top indicate the distributions of the acquired firms. And well, maybe it's not so surprising, yet certainly concerning to see that the high fitness companies are acquired much more frequently. And from an antitrust perspective, this is problematic. It is these acquisitions that involve startups that could compete later on. Think Instagram, for instance. These acquisitions gradually deplete the pool of high fitness firms, and unfortunately, they often go unnoticed. So the main message here is that it's really about growth of competition rather than size of individual firms that are the concern. And regulators should focus on sustaining a high fitness, high growth environment rather than just focusing on the few largest firms. So to reiterate what Sandy and Robert already emphasized, punishing the largest firms is just addressing the symptoms. It is not addressing the root cause. And with that, I would like to hand it back to Sandy to wrap up. Thank you.
Great. So our idea or argument as a function of this different structure of the network economy is to be able to have different metrics that are involved rather than just market share, and to promote greater innovation. And a lot of it comes down to controlling data. I mean, data is the elixir by which network economy companies grow. Number of customers, things you know about the customers, the relationship you have with the customers. And what you need to be able to do is maintain and encourage decentralization of the data rather than allowing concentration of the data. And that's part and parcel of these fast-growing firms, is that by acquiring them, you get centralization of the data, which gives greater power to the corporation to grow. And what we want to be able to do is not only examine acquisition of highly fit small firms, but also encourage merger structures that tend to preserve fitness. So if the data is the thing that allows this explosive growth to happen, then if you want to buy that firm, you ought to have ways that put that data into a trust that allow many corporations to use it under a controlled sort of governance, and not be something where what they're doing is they're locking away this valuable resource. So happy to say more about it, and I see we're sort of out of time, so why don't we stop there and get to the next piece here, the question and answering and comment.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, right on time. Professor Kovacic, would you like to comment? I think you're mute.
Thanks, Jan. It's a delightful paper. I think it fulfills all of the hopes of the creation of the project, and congratulations to Thibaut and the computational project for providing a forum to do this. And I think the basic observation of the paper is that you need a system that's fit for purpose, and where you have extraordinary dynamism in commerce, that has to be matched with policymaking dynamism that is responsive to the concerns that commercial developments raise. It would be a significant departure from existing practice. And I guess one way to think of it is that in the coming 12 months, we'll probably see a rewrite of the government's guidelines involving horizontal mergers and vertical mergers. And I guess a question, one context for the authors to think about is, are you confident enough about the approach that you would build that into the new guidelines? That is, that you would have sections in the guidelines that say, we are ready to put this into practice, and we're ready to go with it. That is it robust enough, rugged enough in your thinking to be worthy of being applied right now? Because that window is going to open. And I guess alongside of it, just one thing to think about is that an impetus for the current review of the guidelines is that those large dominant firms you mentioned are by themselves an appropriate subject of concern, that the purpose of the law is in some way to take existing concentrations of power and to subject them to stronger control. But the opportunity to think about new approaches is coming up right away. A couple of questions and comments about the methodology. In shifting the focus of how we measure what's important, and an insight of the paper is that you have to measure what matters in order to come to an appropriate conclusion. How are we going to define when firms have reached a level of market significance that we call them dominant? What level of control over data becomes significant? Well, how do we know when we've got there? Are we going to use traditional market share measures as one screen to identify who a dominant enterprise is? There are references throughout the paper to dominance and data share. What data shares are significant? And what level of individual firm significance within a network is important? I think that would be very significant to define operational techniques for applying the approach. Another question is how we're going to measure fitness, and how, for purposes of drafting guidelines, providing an operational methodology, will fitness be defined? What criteria will we use? Are we going to use highly qualitative criteria? Will we resort to the kinds of quantitative measures that have been seen important in drafting guidelines as a way of giving guidance to the agency staffs and to the courts themselves? A couple of thoughts about some of the implementing mechanisms. There's discussion about being able to exempt transactions through the refinement of the Hart-Scott-Rodino merger notification process. The exemptions you're describing only apply to the notification obligation. The FTC and the DOJ do not have the capacity to exempt transactions from review altogether. They would not bind a decision by a state government, to use a traditional approach. It wouldn't bind a private party. That is, the agencies don't have the capacity under the existing framework to literally exempt transactions from review. They have the capacity to determine who must file as part of the notification process. Do you have in mind a broader framework where the agencies could, contingent on the adoption of certain alternative methods for data control and sharing, would be exempt from review? That would be a very significant change to the framework. Right now, the agencies do not have that capacity. Another is, how confident are we about the operation of data trusts? Do we have a body of experience that gives them confidence that these will be seen as reliable mechanisms that satisfy expectations about data protection and privacy? Would we likely see that these in some way have to be certified or approved by the public authorities as mechanisms as repositories for the information? Would there be a further review about the terms on which they provide access? Who's able to gain access to the data set? Have we had enough experience with data trusts that, suppose in the coming year we were going to adopt the policy, that we are confident in going ahead and relying on them in the way that the paper suggests we might? Or is there a way to think about doing this by establishing a prototype that perhaps takes some subset of transactions, takes a single sector, and says we're going to test the different parts and see how they work? A final thought about the tax break and the allocation of subsidies. Are you confident that the administrative machinery to do that will do it in a way that sends the money to the companies that need it the most? Will there be, in the structuring of that, a perceived political imperative to distribute funds in a way that satisfies a broad set of political expectations? Who would be the administrative body that would do that? What criteria would they use? Tax is not my field. I simply wonder how the allocation mechanism would work in that instance. So I think it's a wonderful way of thinking about the problem that is not featured in common discussions. Current discussions focus almost entirely on setting absolute caps and prohibitions by the acquisition of dominant enterprises, firms above a certain level of market significance, simply an absolute prohibition. It is exposed to it deals with the Hydra problem by saying you will not in any sense be able to make certain acquisitions. This is a significantly different approach. I think a very fresh addition to the overall debate. Those are my thoughts about implementation. And I guess if you were thinking about the introduction of it, would you be confident in putting it in place next year in writing new merger guidelines? Are there areas that you would want to test more before you put it into play? Because the government's analytical framework is going to be retooled over the next 12 months. But I'm most grateful for the chance to read the paper. And again, I think this fulfills the promise of the exciting approach that is bringing very fresh new thinking into the field. Thanks.
Well, why don't I kick off? You asked a lot of questions, which are great questions. I think in terms of the description of the dynamics and what the problem is, the business of don't just cut off the head of one hydra, I think we're very confident about that. We see that in all sorts of domains. The mathematics of that are very clear. This is not just about these particular examples. You see it in all sorts of situations. Then the question then becomes is, well, what do you do about it in this sort of situation where you've got particularly focused on companies that are network companies that thrive on data? And I guess that the thing that strikes me is there's a mental shift that needs to happen. So people talk about market share, they talk about sales volume, but nowadays data is a primary means of production, like money, like labor. And dominance in data, so this is antitrust, to me, antitrust about data, data monopolies. And the question then is does an acquisition create a monopoly within an important data segment, population segment, like young people under 25 or something like that? And there's an extent that they do, that gets to be problematic. I think that the thing that we're less confident about are the remedies for that. So all of that, I think, is pretty clear. It's interesting that it intersects with data privacy, data ownership, and all of those sorts of questions that are also busy being rewritten. And I think that your suggestion about having a demonstrator within a segment or a prototype is probably a good one for how you actually carry it out, because this is in some ways new territory. One thing about data trusts is I imagine them to be things that are not owned by the companies involved, but rather much more public facilities with government oversight. Otherwise, I think it misses the whole thing. The other thing I think that's really important to realize is that data trusts like this, as a general principle, should not ever share data. What they can share is statistics about data. They can share statistics about segments of data. And you can do this in a way that doesn't threaten individual privacy. And what that does is that makes for a much more liquid market in data insights, but without exposing the data to general distribution. So that's sort of what I want to put in. Robert, Sandro, please jump in. I know you have thought about different aspects of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key question about our confidence in implementing this in the next 12 months, I think that in our group and the way we think about these regulations, it's imperative to experiment, right? It's imperative to actually collect data and figure out like whether the things we think matter. And so the idea of some sort of regulatory sandbox and finding an area where we can put some of these interventions into place and actually measure the outcomes, which requires measuring outcomes and knowing what we're looking for is key. And I think we would be reluctant to say, you know, we figured it out and here's the solution, but rather what we're hoping to do, and it sounds like we were able to do, is to kind of offer a new perspective and also bring in our expertise in network science and some other disciplines to look at antitrust kind of through a new lens. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. And thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot, Robert and Professor Pedler and Professor Kovacic. We have a couple of questions from the Q&A, and I think we might add one about data trust that we just discussed. There's a question from Caroline Thomas. I think to the author of the paper, but Professor Kovacic, feel free to jump in with your thoughts as well. The question is, do you think we need to address data with problem? EU seems to be going one way. And what do you think about the solution that the data should be owned by the data subject and stored on a blockchain with the owner able to give and retract consent to use it?
So this is probably my key area. Let me answer about that. So ownership is a funny concept when it comes to data, because most data is co-created. Clearly, there is the notion of personal data, which is sensitive, and both the California law and the EU law give people control over that, but not sole ownership over, for instance, aggregates of that. The aggregates are often owned by the company. Putting things directly on a blockchain is silly. Blockchains aren't meant for that. You can put them, you can have data stores which are pointed to by a blockchain. That's fine. But that doesn't get to the point of who controls it and how. And the point of data trusts, which are attracting a lot of attention, is that data is complicated. The situation changes. Individuals like myself, who are presumably expert, can't handle it. It's too complicated. We can't anticipate it. So like a bank, like a credit union that's owned by its members and does not take data from it, money from its members, it holds money for its members. You can imagine a data trust that is owned by the members. It holds data for the people and carries out the sensitive, continuous task of establishing policy and use and remuneration for data. And I think that idea that data is as important to money and needs the sort of infrastructure that money has is a key insight. You can't just say, oh, everybody take care of your data. That's just not going to work.
Great, thanks so much. I think we have another question about nascent competitors. So I think we can allow one more question, and then you can also have 1 or 2 minutes to give final thoughts before the end of the panel. The first question is, I think we can combine the two. It's from Fabiana Di Porto and from an anonymous attendee. So we agree that nurturing nascent competitors is a great idea, and small businesses are often fed by the data, and their growth might depend on constant data flows that would come from the hydras, as you call them in your paper. And I think question to the authors of the paper would be: would you also advocate for rules that foster data flows from big to small businesses?
Well, I'm sorry to keep answering first, but the suggestion of the data trust is that we would have the ability to share insights, stratification, statistics about things, but not the data itself. And if you imagine a world where sharing of those sorts of insights is creating a market in the traditional sense, then yes, small businesses would have the ability to know what Facebook knows about your neighborhood. right? Which they currently don't. I would like to know about what the hospitals know about my neighborhood so that we could get better public health, or what is known about our neighborhood so we can hold government accountable. I think neighborhoods, local institutions need at least insights about their neighborhood that they're currently not able to have because it's siloed away, not only in companies, but in governments and other institutions.
I think also in this area, question to Professor Kovacic would be that from one of the attendees, the many startups actually rely on being acquired by a big player like Google or Facebook. How would you think that the proposed approach in the paper could affect this trend and potentially have an impact on innovation?
You know, the authors can address this more directly. My interpretation of your paper is that you're trying to address that specifically. You're trying to maintain an environment in which you would have a continuing market for smaller enterprises, in which larger enterprises would have the opportunity to buy them, subject to some of the reforms you have in place. And that, in that sense, I see the paper as being more sympathetic to concerns that have been raised about what you do if you simply slam the door shut on acquisitions by larger enterprises of smaller enterprises. And my interpretation of the paper is that you're trying to create an enabling environment in which those transactions can continue, but subject to alternative policy approaches that ensure that they do not, that it maintains a porous open system in which other enterprises are going to be able to come in and thrive.
Yeah, that's certainly one point. If I may add one or two more remarks here. So the question is for the motivations behind the startups. So first of all, let me add that certainly there is some other motivations, like obviously IPO, which is probably the holy grail, but also there is some other firms which just can remain private for a long term and pay off all the VC investors. So there's certainly other exit strategies rather than being acquired. But we really would be also interested to hear from others about certain ideas, how large companies and small companies could cooperate in other ways than just immediately acquiring the company as a whole. So we know we work with a Swiss company, a large telecommunication provider, where they often work with local Swiss startups, but rather than just acquiring them, they have a special legal structure which allows them to become minority shareholders in these companies and to interact with them and have them grow alongside each other rather than just immediately acquire them early on. So there is certainly other structures, and maybe there is some more innovation to be done in this area, also from a legal perspective, to make sure that there is other ways for small firms to interact with largers beyond acquisition.
Some years ago, I was on Google's high-tech advisory board, and I kept telling them they ought to break up the corporation and become something like they are today, Alphabet. But the additional thing I said is they're going to have to control data flows between these startups because it doesn't make any sense to have a distributed structure like that where the data is all pooled. But if the data were actually things where it stayed in the startup, but only certain sorts of value and insights and statistics went back and forth, that could be perhaps publicly audited, then I think that makes sense. It's something more than just a holding company, because it's closer to, say, a cooperative, but of independent players. And as someone who's had small companies, I wouldn't mind entering into a special relationship with one of these huge companies, but you want to maintain autonomy and you want to maintain privateness of the data that you have.
Totally. Thanks. Thanks so much for these answers. We have 4 minutes left. So maybe Professor Kovacic, would you like to have 2 minutes for closing remarks, and then also 2 minutes to the authors of the paper, and we should be right on time to conclude the panel.
Yeah, if this were opera, this would be the point at which we'd give flowers to the performers. I think it's a wonderful contribution. I think of it, and this is a perfect time to do it because the field has opened for a rethink about how it functions. This is exactly the time to do this kind of work. And I guess in the paper, I mean, just a couple of thoughts again is at what point is the ownership of data, is there a critical mass that it becomes important? You can imagine a smaller amount of data, a larger amount of data. For purposes of identifying when it's significant, where is it important? At what point? And I think the other thing you might reflect upon in a further revision of the paper is how much of this can be rolled out, maybe without awaiting the creation of the other institutions. Could you start thinking about this network environment and the way you do as another way of appreciating the market significance of individual firms and what's taking place? Is that something that could be used right away to think in a different way about what's taking place in these sectors? I mean, I see in a way the data trusts as being a technology that hasn't been built yet, perhaps in the way that it would have to. But I think what you've done, if you're thinking about the Apollo program, there came a point where an engineer said that you don't want to take one big heavy thing, land it on the moon, and send the big heavy thing home. It was the idea that you could throw stuff away along the way and send back a much smaller compartment. In order to do that, you had to create a lunar excursion module. It seems to me like the data trust is that technology that hasn't been built yet, hasn't been tested. Maybe that's further down the road as another thing to be done. But you could decide that you're using the general approach to go to the moon and also start working on these other institutional reforms. But I think and maybe some notion of the sandbox prototype. I think a further reflection on your part about what you could roll out now, what you have to start working on if you want the larger vision to be accomplished. But again, it's the right time to be thinking about a new approach to measuring what's important and addressing it. So it's a wonderful paper.
Great, thank you. If I had to add one thing that you could do right now, think about data, not just market share. And that gets you maybe 50% of the way there. Robert, Sandro, final word?
Yeah, I think I want to reiterate the idea about real-time antitrust and how as we move more and more into this network economy, I think it's going to be harder and harder to react retroactively, and the price we pay for waiting for dominance to be achieved is going to be higher and higher. So I think this is a central motivation. Can we spot antitrust early and not bear the cost of anti-competitive behavior? So much from me. Yeah, and thank you so much. This was great.
If I can come in with a final thought on that. I see one, it's an agency I'm affiliated with now. I'm on their board as an outside director, but I know of one agency on earth that is creating the internal capability to do the real-time analysis. That's the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, which has assembled a data and analytics team with 40 people now. Computer scientists, quants, people who can do this kind of work, can work with the data, can talk about what's going on. Many other agencies are only creating the capacity to do this kind of real-time analysis. If there's one place on earth that could do it well, it's the CMA. Do it well right now, in real time.
Great, thank you so much to all the panelists for this discussion. It's been incredibly interesting, really important, and really timely. As Professor Kovacic said, it's time now to think about these things. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And Thibaut, I hand over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. A few thoughts. I think you do have the title for a book, Robert, here, Real-Time Antitrust. I promise you I won't be using it, although it's very tempting. And, it's something that lawyers complain a lot about, that we lag behind the tech. And I wonder sometimes if we really want lawyers to be ahead of the tech. I'm not sure if that's the solution, but to be right behind, I think might be something we may want to experiment. And Bill, you mentioned the moon. So the question is, who's Elon Musk on the panel? Let you decide that one. And for the CMA, luckily, we do have Stephen Hunt, who will come today, actually, to explore what the CMA has been doing. And so maybe the occasion to learn more about it.